A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone with no partnership, never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning in to the live stream. Thank you again for joining us for our Monday discussion, where we will be continuing on the ethics of disagreements in Islam, written by Taha, Jabir, Alalwani. Last week, we had jumped into and began the beginning of chapter number 9, and we'll be continuing until the end of chapter 9 for today. So we'll be picking up where we had last left off, page 108, until the end of this chapter, inshallah. And just as a quick reflection too, so this in particular chapter is after the illustrious age. So we're now getting into a time in which taqlid especially became the primary reason for the dissemination of knowledge to be prescribed according to old methodologies, as opposed to the same methodologies of which those same imams that they're trying to reference used in order to come across the correct decision, or to basically chastise one person according to one madhab as opposed to another. And this, in turn, wound up causing a lot of disservice and a lot of harm to the Muslim Ummah as a whole, but that's putting it lightly. But without further ado, inshallah, let's jump into where we are now. So the chapter 9 jumps into the Ummah in recent times. So this was the condition of the Ummah as it slumbered and stagnated due to taqlid, dreaming of a grandeur of the glorious past. And since the emergence of the split between the executive and the judiciary, again referencing how rulers were no longer the scholars, or scholars were no longer the rulers, or there was scholarship amongst the rulers, there's now distinctively rulers as well as their jurists and their scholars, their a'imah. The masses of Muslims were caught up in a state of bewilderment and tossed about by their own interests and impulses. And the scholars of the Ummah were so busy justifying their own positions that if anyone had studied the legacy of this Ummah, as we are today, which has dazzled the world with his unprecedented achievements, he would hardly believe that such intellectual rigidity and sterility could stem from the earlier enlightened and vibrant generations. And this was the state of the Ummah as the modern European Renaissance got underway. So the Europeans saw before them a Muslim Ummah which had lost virtually everything of its real vitality, and nothing of any substance had remained. And the faith was dormant, and the Muslims themselves were bewildered. And there was no longer any of the old certainty. Behavior had become deviant, steadfastness was lacking, intellectual thought was rigid, ijtihad was then suspended, and the science of jurisprudence was lost, and its innovations were rampant, and the Sunnah was laid to rest, and Islamic consequence grew dim, and all but then had vanished. And it was as if the Ummah, with all of its special characteristics, was no longer itself. And these conditions made the Ummah an easy prey for hostile powers who were lying in wait for this golden opportunity to move in and to finish off the little that remained of Islamic character. And this had led to the situation in which we are now in today. And it is a situation of subjugation, and we are no longer appear to be the capable of conducting our own affairs. They're in the hands of enemies who decide destiny, and instead we beg them to find solutions for problems which are our own making. And during this problem, in this period, the Ummah had tried to gather what remained of its strength to win back its lost glory and recover its balance. And all attempts in this direction had ended up in failure because the means adopted were flawed and not in accordance with the natural laws and patterns set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these attempts have been based on adopting and following alien paradigms and apping others, both of which only compounded the predicament that got us here in the first place. And meanwhile, a new generation in search of a healing balm has begun to explore solutions that are sound and authentically Islamic. And various emerging groups of Muslims have begun to realize that the means for rectifying the condition of the Ummah at this stage in its history must be the same means that were used to set it in the right course at the very beginning. And they have thus turned to Islam and realized how sweet and satisfying it is. And this has produced a phenomenon called the Islamic reawakening. So forces hostile to Islam, despite their own internal differences, never wanted to give a free scope to this blessed awakening. How many are the arms and resources which they are used to combat? And some within the Muslim ranks are also part of this armory and have been used as agents to sabotage the movement for reconstructing the Ummah in the true light of Islam. And one of the most devastating methods used by the enemy was this strategy of divide and rule. And this was facilitated by the existence of rampant discord or ikhtilaf in the Muslim Ummah. And the Islamic awakening, or reawakening even, soon found itself facing the grievous challenge of disagreements or ikhtilaf over and above the many other challenges which consume the energy of the sincere workers for Islam. And energies were further dissipated by the perilous rock of discord. And some among the youth identified themselves with the earlier righteous forebearers or the Salafiyah, used in term when someone claims himself to be a Salafi, and others with the upholders of Hadith, Ahl al-Hadith, which is usually reference one and the same. And one group identified with a particular school of thought, madhab, while others did not see the necessity for this, because all the followers or the main imams, the major imams who made these madhabs, were both upholders of the Hadith, Ahl al-Hadith, except for possibly, if you want to talk about Abu Hanifa, or were following the footsteps of the early righteous forebearers, the Salafiyah. But nonetheless, here among these groups, various accusations of unbelief, blasphemy, harmful innovation, treachery, spying, and so on are bandied about. And all of these accusations ought not to be exchanged between fellow Muslims, let alone publicized through all the available media in total discord and disregard of the fact that the malicious attempts to extinguish the light of Islam are more dangerous to the survival of the Ummah than these differences. And we can even relate and say that there was never a time in which these people, these scholars, despite what they had known, and even if they didn't come to the same agreement, never made accusations of disbelief against one another. They just they had their own ways of being convinced of information and a methodology that worked for them, or which seemed to apply in particular to their experiences in their areas. But in retrospect, we can see that the leading scholars of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence had the reasons to justify their differences of opinion and to lessen their impact. And the master proprietors of disagreement in our times, however, do not have a single plausible basis for justifying their difference. They are not mujahidun, or persons capable of independent reasoning or intellectual thought. They are, or analytical thought, they are rather unthinking followers, or muqalidun, of those among them who raise their voices to proclaim that they are not, in fact, quote unquote, followers, nor do they believe in the duty to follow. And they claim that they derive their rulings and opinions directly from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in reality, they cling to some books of Hadith and follow in the footsteps of their authors in all matters pertaining to the authenticity of a Hadith. and the trustworthy and reliability of its narrators. And some of them claim knowledge of the science which studies the biographies of hadith reporters and the extent of their reliability. And on the basis of studying a single book on this vast subject, a person cannot justifiably elevate themselves to the position of a mujahid. And it is only appropriate that someone who has acquired some real knowledge should not behave like the ignorant person. You practice what you preach, and if you have the knowledge for it, you should act upon it. And thus hurl accusations and insults against one another. And we should realize that the grave dangers facing the Islamic faith and to seek towards warding them off and excluding these dangers. And that person should be keenly concerned to bring together the hearts and the minds of people, even while they follow different schools of thought. And at least they should stick scrupulously to the ethics and the norms, the adab, of proper behavior, which differences will arise, as did the noble scholars of the past. And sincere Muslims had hoped that the Islamic awakening would at least achieve two different objectives. Firstly, it was hoped that it would put an end to heretical and atheistic ideals and false and corrupt ideologies and influences, and in doing so, it was hoped that it would purify the hearts and the minds of many Muslims, many in Muslim societies, and reinstill them in the true Islamic faith. Secondly, it would then propagate the Islamic message throughout the world and make the word of Allah supreme on earth. And it is extremely painful to note that some within the Muslim ranks have deliberately sought to clip the wings of this awakening by shackling it with the fetters of discord, where this was totally unnecessary. The result is that Muslims are distracted by their own mostly petty quarrels. Their efforts are dissipated. Issues have become so confused and mixed up that they are unable to distinguish between the trivial and the more important matters. However, one may ask as well, can such a people deal with their problems according to the level of their importance and order their priorities in such a way to bring about effective renewal of Islamic life? And the effect of discord or khilaf among Muslims, or the perpetuation of its causes, is that it must be stressed, and a great treason to the goals of Islam. And it is tantamount to destroying the contemporary Islamic awakening, which has revitalized the hopes and aspirations of Muslims. And it is hindrance to the onward march of Islam. It dissipates the sincere efforts of those striving in the cause of Islam and would incur the displeasure of Allah. And today, for the reasons, one of the most important obligations on Muslims in general and those who work for Islam in particular after their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to work for the unification of all Islamic groups and elements and to eradicate all factors that are causing discord among them. If this goal proves impossible to achieve, then let us keep our differences to the minimum and well within the ethics and norms of behavior set by those righteous forebearers. And differences of opinion do not prevent a genuine meeting of hearts in order to bring about a renewal of the noble Islamic life. And this can be achieved only when intentions are sincere and purely for the sake of Allah. When this becomes a reality, the support and success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not be denied. But some of the causes regarding the differences today is that, differences of opinion naturally occur from one age to another. Each age will naturally bequeath some of its problems to a succeeding age. And today, one of the most important and conspicuous causes of differences between Muslims is the ignorance of Islam or deficient knowledge of Islam. And the state of education of Muslims before the arrival of aggressive colonialism was deplorable, and it became increasingly worse after the penetration of colonial colonialism in the Muslim lands. And the occupiers knew precisely where the Muslim Ummah was most vulnerable, and so began to put in place educational systems and programs and institutions for colonizing Muslim minds and changing their ideas to conform to their own interests and worldviews. And this policy of infiltration was calculated to make the Muslims accept the new anti-Islamic world order in the name of progress and modernization on the European model. And they argued that this rise of progress and civilization in Europe was only possible through the overflowing of religious-based laws and loosening the stranglehold of the church. And religion as such, they argued, was nothing more than an impediment that prevented humanity from attaining freedom and prosperity. And these claims might very well be true with regard to other religions. They certainly cannot be applied to Islam, for Islam promotes human happiness and the realization of human potentialities and is guided by the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the effort to sever the Muslim Ummah from the mainsprings of its existence and Islamic moorings, the imperialists placed obstacles and sanctions against Islamic education, and the Arabic language was just the medium of Islamic education. And to realize that this objective, students who sought an Islamic education found themselves neglected and devalued. And the studies that they pursued were also underrated, and they were denied the professional education and training that would enable them to get decent jobs and salaries. And on the other hand, students who enrolled in the modern schools on the colonialist patterns were given special care and attention. The doors of opportunity were opened before them, and they were groomed as the new leaders of the Ummah. And in this way, the grip tightened around the necks of those who were interested in Islamic education and the Arabic language. And the avenues for seeking such an education were then blocked. And in most Muslim countries, soon only a few turned to Islamic education, and eventually the standards then dropped. And most of them who wanted such an education became like the one who tills the soil but does not expect to reap any produce. Only specific circumstances encouraged them to seek an education, and they did not have the strength to free themselves from its hold even after graduation, for the way remained blocked before them. And they did not have the capacity to perform the role which a scholar should perform in society and bring to fruition the message within which he is entrusted. And with the doors of opportunity then blocked, they lost their independence, their personalities weakened, and they were induced to join the official religious organization set up in advance to serve pre-planned and limited objectives. And they were unable to get beyond these inasmuch as they were denied the opportunity to perform their role properly in society. And as a result, people had lost their faith in them. And in an attempt to deepen the gulf between the Ummah and its faith and to cut the roots which connected it with the Sharia, those who opposed Islam unjustly tried to place Islamic education and the teaching of Arabic in the background. The field was left open for alien concepts and ideologies, which were attractively presented to the youth, but only exposed them to pain, worry, and bitterness. And every type of ideology was presented to them, from communism to socialism and from radicalism to nationalism and democracy. And however beautifully each was packaged, it only served to increase the disgrace of the Muslim Ummah to an unprecedented level. And it became clear then to many Muslims, however, that Islam alone was capable of curing the problems of the Ummah, uplifting it from its decline and arresting the causes of decadence. And after groping aimlessly in the darkness, they decided on their own to turn to Islam out of concern for themselves and for their religion. And when they came against the problem of properly understanding the religion and acquiring a knowledge of its laws, they resorted to books which could not give them a sound, complete, and comprehensive understanding of the system, and they were unable to acquire a knowledge for its purposes and of its holistic nature, just like the group of blind men who passes their hands over different parts of an elephant's body, each one insisting that the part he touched was the elephant. And this is the condition of Muslims in relation to Islam today. And the Muslim Ummah have been split up into smaller groups and factions. And there are those who have turned their backs on Islam and oscillate between the East and the West as if their only connection with Islam was their names and the past legacy of Islam. And were it not for a certain timidity, they would perhaps sever all connections with Islam. And there are others who yearn to come back to Islam, but when they do, they go along different paths and end up disagreeing amongst themselves. And this makes them an easy prey for Islam's opponents. Everywhere, rulers surrounding them and offer them no way out. They are finished off completely before they are able to recover their balance and find the straight way. So then the author goes into here of the way to recovery. So now that the disease which has plagued the Ummah for so long has been identified, we need to produce a remedy and chart a course towards recovery. So sincere Muslims engaged in the field of promoting Islam and who are deeply conscious of the painful reality of the Muslim situation should identify groups of talented Muslim youths and make available to them the best means to study the sciences of the Sharia. This should be at the hands of the few remaining scholars who are known for their depth of knowledge, uprightness, piety, and constructive thought, and who have a sound insight into the purposes and holistic nature of the Sharia, as well as a good understanding of its component sciences. And these scholars should adopt the educational principles and methods of the Noble Prophet ﷺ. And this body of talented Muslim youth should also be trained by another group who are also well equipped with knowledge of the various contemporary sciences and who have a high level of sincerity and piety. And this combination will hopefully set the place for an Islamic awakening and help the Ummah recover its strength and integrity. And in the process, it will resume its leading role and rescue humanity from rushing headlong day by day into disaster. There is no salvation for humanity except through Islam. And secondly, Muslims are living through an intellectual crisis whose dimensions are perceived only by a small minority. And in order to tackle this crisis, Muslims must rectify their manner of thinking. And the crisis is distinctly manifest in the collapse of the Ummah's institutions, in the non-existence of properly organized bodies, in the low levels of consciousness, knowledge, and training of young Muslims, or in the disintegration of mutual bonds between the believers, or in the corruption and deviation of most of the leaders of the Muslim world, in all of the malicious endeavors to sabotage the well-intentioned efforts of groups of upright and pious Muslims. And all this is due to the fact that Islam is far away from the lives of Muslims. There is a yawning gap between the ideals of Islam and the realities of the Muslim world. Non-Muslims see Islam as a cloud which produces no rain and therefore does not quicken the dead earth, or they see it as water on a hard rock on which no vegetation or produce ever grows. This is because Muslim hearts have become atrophied and encrusted with rust. Their eyes have become bleary and can hardly distinguish between the good and the evil. And it has become evident that the various educational institutions in the Muslim world have miserably failed to produce the true balanced Muslim individual. Universities which have been set up in Muslim countries on the lines of Western models do not see it as part of their task to prepare and to produce Muslim scholars in all branches of knowledge so that they can Islamically reform the various disciplines at their disposal, but instead they seek their task at preparing graduates infatuated with the arts and the sciences of the West. And how quickly do such graduates turn their backs on the essential beliefs of Islam and its goals and objectives for life. And these universities produce generations whose sense of belonging to Islam is weak, whose thinking is confused, and who are unable to use their knowledge in the service of the Muslim Ummah. So educational institutions, which are regarded as Islamic, such as Al-Azhar or other universities, colleges, and institutes patterned along similar lines, have achieved a limited success for the benefit of the Ummah, says the author. And they have managed to produce some excellent specialists in some sciences of the Sharia, but they have failed to provide the Ummah with able and innovative Muslim scholars and thinkers capable of presenting Islam as a holistic system with distinctive goals and objectives. And such scholars have not been able to confront contemporary challenges and overcome them. And in the process, Islamic thought has atrophied and has failed to shape the thinking of Muslims and the direction of their lives. And as a result, Muslim minds and hearts have remained wide open to the infiltration of all kinds of ideas which seek to subvert Islam. And Muslims have become incapable of dealing with the problems facing themselves in politics, economics, social organization, and other sorts of fields. And they have been content merely to transmit and imitate what others are thinking and doing. And the blind adoption of alien ideals and ideas and practices has created disagreement and dissension amongst the various sections of the Ummah. And these disagreements have mostly been resolved in the interest of Western-minded groups who are culturally enthralled to the West. And instead of unifying their ranks and working together to face these threats and challenges, the devout Muslims unfortunately have become engaged in wrangling over controversial issues. And this is mainly because of the intellectual confusion and the failure to distinguish between the parts and the whole, and between the ultimate purposes of the law and its underlying purposes. And principles. And we are in a desperate need of sound and vigorous Islamic thought, which is built upon an understanding of the spirit of Islam, its ultimate purposes, its overall principles, and the hierarchy of its laws derived from its great original sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. And we also need to study the legacy and the methodology of our righteous forebears as they studied and acted upon these original sources in the early illustrious centuries. This will then enable us to achieve a clear and complete perception that Islam is the only path for the salvation of the Muslim Ummah, and that it contains the ideal solution for all of its problems. And this clear perception will then rally the Ummah around the fundamentals of Islamic thought and will steer away from evil intrigues and from manipulations. And lastly, before we close this chapter, the author mentions, when the Ummah is thus firmly and correctly established and is able to identify its wounds, its ailments, its source of malady, and the steps which must be taken to arrive at a required cure and to realize the desired goal, will undoubtedly become clear. That is well within its reach. Alhamdulillah. And with that, we come to the closing of chapter 9. Next week, we will be reading 10, the way forward. With that, we will go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.